JEM Publishing presents the unabridged recording of Rescuing Melissa, The Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1, written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes. 1. Contracts. Melissa. Melissa Patterson's 10th wedding anniversary should have been a happy occasion, a milestone of marital bliss, not this soul-shattering death. She stood in her kitchen, gripping the stack of papers, and held back the tears as she stared at the top page. 2 simple scratches of ink were all it had taken to negate 10 long years of marital terror. 10 years ago, she'd been the proverbial blushing bride. The fairytale wedding had been the social event of the season, a perfect start to her first day in hell. The divorce had been her lawyer's idea, as if she could separate herself from Scott Patterson's name. The world believed she'd been complicit in his crimes. Her lawyer said she deserved to be free. Her shaky hand had scrawled a much less elegant mark than her husband's. Even on death row, Scott lost none of his confidence. The elegance of his signature mocked her hurried scratches, precise and controlled like the killer inside. What had gone through his mind as he'd pinned his name? She'd never know, and he'd die with his arrogance fully intact. Maybe then she'd be free. Melissa scrubbed the tears from her cheeks, glanced at the dirty dishes on the counter, the dried food needing to be scraped, and the silverware cluttering the sink. She made the conscious decision to leave the mess for later. Scott would have never allowed such a thing. But this wasn't his house, and she didn't need to obey his rules. Not anymore. A run would clear her mind. Melissa tossed the divorce papers onto the counter next to the dirty dishes and went to change into her running gear. Her pink and purple barefoot running shoes didn't match the blue and yellow of her outfit. Not that it mattered. She had long since abandoned the need to maintain a perfect appearance. Scott's punishments were no longer something to fear, and after today, he would be gone for good. Her greatest fear was whether his harsh voice would still whisper admonishments in her head after his death. He'd done it from prison for 3 years, and she had no reason to believe that would change. She yanked her hair into a lopsided scrunchie and could almost hear Scott scolding her sloppiness. Gritting her teeth, she silenced his reprimand with a yank on her messy bun. Melissa grabbed her keys and locked the front door. On the front porch, the headline of the morning newspaper screamed the top news: "Stay of execution denied for Fairytale Killer." She sent the paper flying off her front porch with a swift kick, where it splashed in a muddy puddle on the lawn, then placed the key under the mat. Gray clouds threatened. Maybe the rain would wash away the memories, drown out Scott's incessant nattering in her head, or cleanse the ache in her heart. A storm would be a perfect match for her mood. A 10K run should do the trick. 2 kilometers in, the acidic burn of a fast-paced run heated her muscles. Her chest expanded, pulling in air with every third strike of her foot. She'd taken up running during Scott's trial, a long, drawn-out process lasting more than a year. Beating up her body had been precisely the therapy she had needed to endure the media circus imposed on her life. Every day of that year was a living hell. The 2 years with him on death row had been only a little better. By the halfway mark, her legs ached, and her breathing deepened. Endorphins flooded her body. With a famous runner's high achieved, she relaxed into her stride. Overhead, the gloomy sky darkened and dumped rain. 1 kilometer left. She welcomed the fat drops. The musty smell of the downpour invigorated her, even as the rain soaked her clothes. A thunderclap sounded overhead, a sharp sound, followed by a low, throaty rumble she felt more than heard. Hail followed the thunder. A glance at the darkening clouds rewarded her with a bolt of lightning shattering the sky. The answering thunderclap followed a second later. The lightning was closer than was safe. She needed to get out of the weather. The moist air ahead of the storm gave way to cooler temperatures, chilling her to the bone. Time to find shelter. Lightning crackled through the air, striking a tree across the park. Smoke spiraled into the sky as the tree sizzled. Pea-sized pellets rained down from the heavily laden sky. Lightning flashed, sinking to the beat of a memory. Blinding pain when Scott struck with his belt. PTSD, the therapist said. It would fade with time, he said. Her therapist said a lot of things Melissa didn't believe. 5 bolts of lightning struck in quick succession. Resounding peals of thunder followed. It reminded her of the whoosh that preceded the strike of Scott's belt. Her heart skipped a beat, and the massive blast had her tripping over her feet. 10 years of her life wasted. She screamed her frustration into the clouds and ran as the force of Mother Nature answered her cry. The jogging path met with a road a quarter-mile down where the neighborhood park ended. She needed to get to one of the businesses on Main Street, where she could wait out the storm. Time to pick up the pace. The sky took on a greenish cast. Clouds dipped low, roiling as the storm whipped them to a froth. The wind beat at her, hail slammed into her, first from the right, then the left. It lashed out, as if unsure how to best launch its attack on her delicate flesh. Her heart rate spiked, not from running, but from the sickening hue cast in the sky. Tornadoes, while rare, weren't unheard of in the small town of Fort Walton. Melissa had never seen a tornado and didn't want to start now. She quickened her pace, muscles protesting and lungs burning. The storm raged, building around her as if feeding off her turbulent emotions. Like Scott had done too many times to count, the storm lashed out at her, furious and raw, beating her until her skin stung. She stumbled, afraid for her safety and angry she'd been foolish enough to go running during a storm. She turned onto the sidewalk that edged the tree-lined Main Street. Down the road through the sheets of driving rain, a coffee shop's open sign flashed a welcome beacon. She ducked her head and sprinted for safety. Electricity filled the air. The tiny hairs on her arms lifted. A flash of molten light burned to her left. Her skin tingled. A concussive force slammed into her as she ran. She stumbled from the sidewalk into the street, arms and legs spinning in a wild tangle of limbs. Before her head hit the blacktop, twin headlights of a black SUV blazed in her eyes. The screech of tires had Melissa cringing for an impact that never came. Her vision dimmed, and she lost her fight to stay conscious.
2. Twister. CJ. A petite brunette launched herself into the street. CJ slammed the brakes of his rented SUV, tires squealing over the wet pavement. The car's windows rattled with the storm, and his vision sparked with after-images from a lightning strike. He swerved, turning the wheel to avoid a spin. Steering through it, he tapped the brakes to regain traction. A large piece of hail landed on the front windshield, splintering the safety glass into a spiderweb of cracks. Fucking double fuck. He came to a stop and jammed the transmission into park. The woman sprawled across the pavement. Had that lightning hit her? Was she dead? No way to know unless he got out of the car. But she wasn't moving. Shit, what was that noise? Sounded like a freight train. He glanced left, peering through the sleeting rain. A funnel cloud snaked toward the ground less than half a mile away. Shit. He unbuckled and vaulted out of the car. Every nerve in his body came alive. Fear over whether the tornado would touch down and concern for the lifeless woman spiked through his veins. Thank God he'd stopped. Sprinting to the unconscious woman, he knelt at her side and felt for a pulse. A faint beat trembled against the pad of his finger. Still alive, then. After he checked for injuries, CJ pulled her over his shoulder, praying she didn't have a neck injury. Didn't have time to stabilize her cervical spine, not with a whirling beast trying to touch down. Time to move. Racing back to the car, he opened the hatch, thinking there'd be more room there, and set her down with as much care as possible. With another curse, he shut the back hatch as the growl of the tornado approached. Dirt and debris spun in the air. Too damn close. He scrambled to the driver's side and jumped inside. A roar filled the air as the tornado touched down and churned toward him. With the windshield cracked into 1,000 pieces, he couldn't see shit. He leaned back and kicked at the window until the sheet of safety glass crumpled outward. Debris lifted by the wind hit him in the face. They had little time. He slammed his foot down on the gas. The tires screeched on the wet blacktop, slipping for a heart-stopping moment before launching him and his unconscious passenger forward through the thickening cloud of grass, dirt, and other debris. Across the street, most of the local businesses were closed. A face peered out the window of a coffee shop. He prayed the person in the coffee shop sought shelter somewhere in the interior of the brick-and-mortar facade. He headed to a garage he'd passed 100 yards back. It should provide more protection against a tornado than a building. If memory served, the ramp angled down, going below ground. He shifted his foot, tapping the brake to spin the car in a 180-degree arc. The tornado ripped up the ground behind him, destroying the manicured park. It rumbled down the street, chasing him. Fuck. Rain blinded him through the missing windshield, and twigs slapped at his face. He blew through a red light. Everyone except him and the crazy lady out for a jog had taken shelter. Something big slammed into the back of the car, lifting the rear wheels and making him swerve. He regained control, thankful he'd been hit in the back instead of on the side or front. If the airbags had deployed, he would have been toast. The parking garage came into view. He skidded, drifting the curve, and pulled into the entrance. Sticks turned into branches and tree trunks. An awning from a local business cartwheeled in the air. He barely heard the squeal of tires over the freight train of destruction hurtling down the street. Turning the corner, he headed down to the next level. His ears popped with the sudden pressure drop. He had only a passing glimpse of the funnel as it brushed past the entrance, sucking parked cars into its vortex. He stopped another level down, pulling into a vacant space. His breathing was ragged, and his pulse thrummed along at a steady clip. Behind him the woman moaned. He sighed. On leave, and he was still saving lives. The storm continued to rage, but the tornado moved on to play with other victims. CJ exited the vehicle to check on the woman's injuries. The rental was ruined. In addition to the missing windshield, dents littered the roof and hood, and flying objects put deep gouges in the quarter panels. Oh, and the rear bumper was missing. He yanked on the back hatch, trying to open it. Whatever hit the car twisted the frame. He tugged a few times, but it wouldn't budge. Thank God he purchased the extra insurance the rental agency strong-armed him into buying. He'd have to drop the back seat and pull her out of the car through the back door. Since he didn't know how severe her injuries might be, he was a little reluctant to move her again. He fished out a flashlight from his luggage and climbed in the back. Airway, breathing, and circulation intact. CJ moved to the secondary survey, looking for other injuries. He ran his fingers through her matted hair. There was a lump beside the messiest ponytail he'd ever seen. Her hair was wet from the rain, but there didn't seem to be any blood. Her relaxed features made her look so fragile. Fuck, but she was breathtaking. What the hell was he thinking? The woman was hurt and unconscious. He was supposed to be a professional, but damn, he wasn't dead. She had a strong, steady pulse, and her chest rose and fell in a natural rhythm. Both were reassuring signs. The tight exercise clothes she wore distracted him. They clung to her curves and pulled his eyes away from his professional assessment. Goosebumps prickled the skin of her arms. Shit, the poor thing had to be freezing. Her pained moan snapped him back to business. Her left arm was bruised, no more lumps on her head, and no apparent broken bones. A medic by trade, he was suspicious of internal injuries. He continued with his assessment, lifting her shirt and lowering the waistband of her running pants. He grimaced at the deep bruising over the left side of her chest, which extended to her hip. She might have cracked her ribs, but since her breathing wasn't labored, he wasn't concerned about damage to her lungs. Her abdomen, on the other hand, worried him. He needed to call 911 but didn't have reception. The chance ambulances were running was low, and, complicating matters, he didn't know where the local hospitals were located. He needed to get to the street to make the call, maybe even search for hospital locations to take her himself. She didn't appear to be in immediate danger, although the bruising on her side suggested internal injuries. He'd feel better if she woke up. He pulled off his jacket and covered her to keep her warm. Sharing body heat would be more efficient, but he could only imagine what she'd think waking up in a stranger's arms. Instead, he made her as comfortable as possible. He crawled back over the folded rear seat and grabbed his duffel. He was cold, too, drenched to the bone by the rain. The adrenaline coursing through his veins faded, leaving him with shaky hands and chills. Damn, the sleepy little town of Fort Walton was full of surprises. He came for an execution, and now he'd survived his first tornado. CJ stripped and changed into something dry. While he waited, he pulled out the local daily paper and reread the headline for the 100th time. Stay of execution denied for Fairytale Killer. He planned to watch a monster be put down. His sister would finally have justice, and he'd find peace. 3. Mint Cookies. Pierce. 2 Girl Scouts greeted me at the front door. A little girl in an adorable brownie vest held hands with another girl wearing a green sash. Their pressed outfits beamed with neatly sewn badges. Well, hello. A grin stretched across my face. Little girls were full of such promise for the powerful women they would one day become. A strength I would challenge until they broke beneath me. I crouched down, getting eye to eye, where I would be less threatening. The brownie had a lock of hair curling at the corner of her eye. My fingers twitched with the need to brush the hairs away from her face. A woman supervised the girls from the curb, probably the mother. My fingers clenched, and then I raised my hand to wave. She returned my wave with a shy one of her own. So friendly and trusting, so naive and stupid. Her children were younger versions of herself and turned my thoughts in delectable directions. I couldn't have the girls, they were too young, and I had standards. But the woman held promise. What can I do for you? I surveyed the gathering clouds, wondering why 2 little girls would be out when it was about to storm. The girl in green grasped her sister's hand.
We're selling Girl Scout cookies, sir. Would you like to buy some?
She glanced up at the gray sky.
Mama says we have a little while before the storm, and we have a
Her face scrunched up.
quota to reach.
I loved the way her mouth worked out the unfamiliar sounds of such a big word. A quota! I'd love to! I pitched my voice high and brought my hands over my heart, knowing it would make the girls smile. The brownie giggled. I gave her a wink. I love Girl Scout cookies. Please tell me you have Thin Mints. I love them. The older girl's expression brightened, but it was her sister with the brown vest who answered.
Yes, sir. We have Thin Mints.
I wanted to tweak her nose, but the watchful mother might not appreciate me touching her daughter. The little girl was so damn adorable with her pigtails and innocent eyes. Her cuteness factor was off the charts. I couldn't help myself and leaned close to inhale her warm, innocent scent. Her older sister drew back, but I expected the reaction. As charming as I was, some females, the smart ones, pulled away, acting instinctively for self-preservation. I sensed great intelligence in my green-sashed friend. May I please have 10 boxes?
10 boxes, sir?
The little girl's brown eyes brightened. She jumped up and down. Oh, yes, 10. I fished for my wallet and pulled out 2 crisp $50 bills. Here, this should cover it. The little girl screwed her face up as she tried to do the math, failed, and referenced a card in her hand.
It's $5 a box, sir. That's $50.
She stared at the money and pulled at her ear as she worked out the math.
That's too much.
I couldn't resist. I tweaked her nose. She grinned and gave me the most delicious giggle. 50 for the cookies and 50 for your troop. I pointed to her mother standing on the curb. You tell your mama to take you somewhere extra special. Good girls deserve special treats, don't you think? The advancing storm darkened the sky. I loved thunderstorms in springtime. The musty smell of fresh rain reminded me of the delectable scents below the house.
Oh, yes, sir.
The little brownie clapped her tiny hands. Her older sister glanced over her shoulder.
I need to check if we have 10 boxes.
I offered the brownie the cash, but her sister yanked the money out of my hand. That little girl needed a spanking. "I'll wait here," I said. "Go get my cookies while I chat with your sister." The older one wrinkled her nose and twisted her lips.
Anna, you get the cookies. I'll wait here.
She handed Anna the cash. My little brownie Anna twisted her mouth into a pout, but she turned and obeyed at the stern look from her sister. Why was it women always felt the need to tell others what to do? Anna's sister needed to mind her own business and let Anna do what she wanted. As Anna ran to her mother, I made small talk with her sister. "How old are you?"
I'm 11.
Her arms crossed over a blossoming chest. Girls seemed to mature at younger and younger ages. Still, this girl was too young for my tastes. Maybe several years down the road, after she grew those tiny nubs into breasts, I'd take her as one of my princesses. Anna's sister had a backbone. I loved a challenge. She probably got that quality from her mother. The girl and I traded silence while Anna skipped down the path to the curb, stopping to pick up an earthworm and toss the poor creature in the grass. Her mother's lips formed an O in surprise after the brownie handed over the cash, and my attention focused hard on that mouth. I had no use for the girls, but there were several ways I could use their mother. Anna's sister shifted a step back, placing more distance between us. We waited for their mother to get the cookies out of the trunk of the car. Little Anna balanced 10 boxes of Thin Mints in her arms as she carefully walked back to my door.
Sir,
The little girl said with pride.
your cookies.
I relieved her of her burden. My fingers skated across the buttery smoothness of her skin, and a shiver worked its way down my back. I straightened and waved to the girl's mother, raising my voice so she could hear me. "Thank you. I'm so happy you stopped by." A light pattering of rain fell. "You better hurry," I said to the girls. "You want to beat the rain." The little brownie flapped her hand goodbye. Her sister spun in a huff. I needed to introduce myself to their mother. The sky dumped rain, and I stayed under cover of the porch. The girls squealed as their mother waved them to the car. Another time, then. The girls ran down my sidewalk, screeching as rain saturated their clothes. I waved goodbye to their mother and closed my front door. Thin Mints were best served cold, but I'd never been good at denying myself. I ripped open a pack and shoved 2 cookies into my mouth. My eyes closed when the minty chocolate melted on my tongue. For a moment, I wondered if my princesses might appreciate the cookies, but they hadn't behaved today. Treats had to be earned. Lightning flashed, followed by peals of thunder that rattled the kitchen windows. Time to get back to my princesses. The storm would make them uncomfortable and scared, and they depended on me to keep them safe. The wind whipped through the street, and hail bounced and skittered on the lawn. My attention shifted to the kitchen counter where the morning paper rested. I reread the headline for the 100th time. "Stay of execution denied for Fairytale Killer." Today the world would lose a great man, but I would carry on his work. He would find peace while I created a masterpiece. I went to the door leading down to my basement. I opened it, walked through, and turned to fasten the lock behind me, checking to make sure it was secure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There was another door at the bottom of the stairs. I hummed as I unlocked and then refastened this lock, counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Through my basement and past the racks holding my wine collection, I hummed with anticipation. A third door was hidden from view behind the stacks of wine. I checked the lock. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Best not to make a mistake. He hadn't been so careful, and would pay for that error with his life. That would never happen to me. I was too methodical and smarter than my mentor. Satisfied all was well, I pushed aside the rack of wine to reveal the third door. This door had a combination lock, and I spun the dial 6 times, then stepped into the tunnel. The ceiling was low here, and I stooped to avoid hitting my head. The rich sense of earth and loam greeted me, and I breathed in deep. The musty smell reminded me of home. A long passage extended before me, years of work hacking a tunnel out of the dirt. Rough-hewn timbers braced the walls and ceiling. A string of bulbs lit the distance. This was my slice of heaven, a kingdom for a prince, and his most precious possessions. 6 sacred obligations, all modeled after the great work of my mentor. The key in my pocket opened the last door with a soft snick of metal on metal. I flicked on the lights, and my dungeon greeted me with a welcoming glow and the whimpers of my princesses. I straightened to my full height and stretched. Split roughly into thirds, the modified survival shelter held the king bed closest to the door. 8 cages occupied the middle third of the room, 4 on each side. I kept an open space in the back where I'd anchored chains into the stone wall and hung my toys against the wall. Unlike the tunnel, I'd braced the insides of this room with metal sheeting and steel supports. While dirt was an excellent insulator, I'd nearly lost my first 2 princesses to hypothermia. I hadn't realized how cold they would get living underground. I'd installed a raised wooden floor. In addition to lights, I granted them the luxury of heat. How comfortable they remained depended on how well they behaved. They had their chamber pots and a chore rotation to keep the place neat and tidy. I swore I'd never again risk the health of my princesses because of my stupidity. A princess was waiting for my return. I'd left her chained to the king-sized bed, but first I needed to lock the door from the inside. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I sighed. We were once again whole, a prince and his princesses. Cinderella should have greeted me with a smile, but she glared at me instead. A muscle ticked in my jaw. Is this how you greet your Prince Charming? I slapped her face, leaving a red handprint. Always the noisy one, Cinderella screamed. My cock responded, throbbing with anticipation and thickening with need. I slapped her again because it felt good. Whimpers sounded from the cages, but I didn't spare a look for my other princesses. This was Cinderella's moment. The others would serve when it was their turn. Today I celebrated the end of a great man's life. I would take my princesses in the same order he took his, a memorial of sorts to a man I admired. Cinderella's brilliant blue eyes brimmed with tears and flicked to mine before jerking away. She knew better than to gaze upon my face. Her tears fell in fat, juicy drops, speeding up my heartbeat and stiffening my aching cock. She struggled to hold back her sobs and failed. I drank in her terror, letting it stoke my desires, feeding that primal need inside. I chided, "You're a mess." The tears had ruined her makeup. I held a mirror to let her see how she'd smeared her lipstick and how her mascara had run. Under the glow of the incandescent bulbs, black rivers streamed down her cheeks. That last slap smeared her ruby lipstick, and the smudge left a streak 2 shades brighter than the ones made by my palm. Golden curls spilled over her shoulders and rested upon her bare breasts. I couldn't resist. I took her nipples and squeezed, drawing out a hiss from between her gritted teeth. The sound made my fingers dig into her soft flesh, where they left dark splotches on her pillowy breasts. "Are you allowed to make a sound?" We had been through this before. I was tired of repeating myself. Training was such a difficult task, but fortunately, I had plenty of patience.
"My prince,
She cried.
forgive me."
My arousal throbbed. I had finished with the first princess less than an hour ago. The potency of my purpose settled in the ache of my balls. I'd taken medication to make sure I'd be able to service all 6 before midnight struck. Remember, no teeth scraping my skin. I unfastened my pants. I'd almost forgotten. Leaning to the side of the bed, I flicked on the video camera. My journey needed to be documented. With a grip on her hair, I pulled her head forward. Her chains clinked and rattled. Behind me, Red Riding Hood sobbed. I ignored her. She'd been placed back in her cage after a satisfying beating. A sniffle came from Sleeping Beauty, strapped in the corner. Goldilocks remained quiet, but then I had gagged her. Gretel was still passed out in her cage. She had been the first I'd taken today. She'd fought my dominance, and I took her harder than I would have liked. Belle, my beautiful Belle, shuffled in her cage. She remained quiet while I made use of Cinderella. Unlike the others, I didn't chain her when she was in her cage. She was the perfect princess and understood how to behave. She'd been my first, but I would take her last. Cinderella's delicious mouth sought my pleasure. My release gathered at the base of my spine, tickling my balls, then exploded outward in a rush. I crumpled over Cinderella as my vision dimmed. I hated it when I passed out. I roused a minute or two later. My one flaw. I'd been teased about it before, but that never happened anymore. Cinderella deserved a reward. A legend died today, but I would carry on my mentor's torch. He thought my plan fitting and had given his blessing. I would have my queen.
4. Pink lace. Melissa. Melissa's skull felt like it would explode. She dragged a hand to her temple, and a wet tangle of hair greeted her exploring fingers. She cracked an eyelid. Why is it dark? Where the hell am I? Her ribs ached. Her left hip throbbed, and her arm hurt. She groaned against biting pain.
Shh.
An unfamiliar voice spoke.
You're safe.
Her vision adjusted to the dim light. She remembered nothing. Something crinkled over her body, thin but warm. She knocked it off, trying to sit up. Wrong move. Pain lanced down her side, and a chill air brushed against her skin, making her shiver. Light filtered through windows of a car? How did she get in the back of a car? A roaring of blood pounded past her ears, and she clamped her hand to her head as pain blossomed anew.
Try not to move,
The gentle voice said.
You might have a concussion, and I'm worried about your ribs. There's a tornado, but you're safe in a parking garage.
There was that crinkling noise again. A hand touched her shoulder. Don't touch me. She flinched.
Darling, calm down.
The man's voice sounded warm and safe. Don't call me darling. She tried to scoot away, but overwhelming pain pulled her up short. Scott had used that name. What was it with Southern men and the annoying habit of calling every woman darling? She wasn't some silly girl. She was a grown woman, strong and self-sufficient. She also found herself trapped in the back of a stranger's car with no memory of how she'd gotten there. She wasn't as cold as she thought she should be, considering her clothes were soaked. Her toes squished in her 5-toed running shoes, the only part of her body which didn't ache.
Okay, what do you remember?
The man's deep voice filled the air with sultry tones. The words dripped like liquid silk from his tongue, splashing over her and exerting a calming influence. The thick drawl relaxed her as it filled the too small space of the car with a pleasing warmth, which meant he was far too close. The faintest scent of sandalwood, musk, and rain hung in the air. There was a click, and a light shined in her eyes. She flinched and cried out from the movement.
Sorry,
he said. He turned the light on himself, revealing the sharp angular lines of a smooth square jaw, a close-cropped military hairstyle, and brilliant blue eyes. He regarded her with intense interest. His eyes sparkled in the light, and his smile touched the edges of those baby blues. Her heart may have stopped for the briefest moment, but then fear kicked back in, jolting her into a frenzy. She scooched back, fighting the pain. He reached for her. Prominent veins climbed the muscles of his forearm and twined around his bicep like vines on a tree.
Charles James Rowan, Jr., at your service, ma'am, but my friends call me CJ. What's your name?
She didn't take his hand. Mr. Rowan, can you please explain what I'm doing in the back of your car? He winked.
Please call me CJ. My father was Mr. Rowan. I never had a particular fondness for him.
She tried to sit. Bad idea. A throbbing in her head came moments before a wave of dizziness. She hissed and settled for curling on her right side, which seemed to be the least offensive position.
Whoa there, don't move around like that.
Why not?
Weren't you listening? You may have a concussion and your side's all bruised up. As soon as it's safe, I'm taking you to a hospital.
I don't remember anything.
Don't worry, it'll come back to you.
I must look a mess. Scott would be furious if he found her in the back of a car with another man. Wait, she didn't have to worry about him anymore, but she still felt wrong breaking a rule and uncomfortable for not looking her best. Scott always insisted she put her best face to the public. Another soft laugh warmed the surrounding air.
I've seen worse messes, but I'd have to say you make a drowned rat look positively stunning.
She closed her eyes and pressed her lips together. The man was honest to a fault. Gee, thanks.
While we wait for the storm to pass, let's see if I can jog your memory. You were running.
Yes, she'd been out running. Pieces of the morning came flooding back. The signed divorce papers making her once again single, lightning followed by thunder, rain, hail, and the greenest sky she'd ever seen. And finally there had been a crack of lightning. She'd been thrown into the street. The screeching of tires was her last memory.
Do you usually set out for a run in the middle of a thunderstorm?
He asked. Not my best decision. His grin brought a smile to her face. She watched him carefully. His attention never once wavered from her face. Most guys would have ogled her breasts by now. She'd always been self-conscious about the size of her breasts. She pulled the crinkly blanket tighter around her body. You said there was a tornado? He saved her from more than a lightning strike. She prayed her neighbors were safe. How bad is the damage? Was anyone else hurt? She clutched the blanket in her cold hands and shivered. His lips pressed together.
I don't know. I scooped you off the pavement and raced into this garage.
You saved me? She sounded like a fool stating the obvious.
Looked like you needed a helping hand.
He gave her a wink, letting her know he was teasing. What could she say to that? Thank you seemed trite. What kind of blanket is this anyway? Feels like I'm wrapped in tinfoil.
It's an emergency blanket. You were shivering. I put my jacket over you, but it was soaked. I keep an emergency kit in my gear, although I've never used the blanket.
Mischief sparkled in his eyes.
I figured it was better than the alternative.
What was the alternative?
Sharing body heat.
Oh. That silenced any more questions. He got out of the car. Where are you going? She didn't want him to leave. CJ chuckled.
I want to get to the street and call an ambulance.
He paused for a second, his gaze turning to her chest. Leaning in, he extended his hand.
Here, let's get you out.
If she didn't move too fast, the throbbing in her head kept to a minimum. The entire left side of her body protested as she moved forward with CJ's help. His strong hands gripped under her arms, and he pulled her free of the vehicle. He lifted her and placed her on the ground, where she weaved on unsteady legs and panted against the pain. "I'm so cold." He wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her against his chest to steady her. Into her ear, that honeyed voice murmured,
"Give yourself a chance to get your balance. Head all right? Dizzy? Nauseous?"
She shook her head, causing a wave of dizziness to wash over her. She leaned against him and clutched at his forearm. Dizzy. Definitely dizzy." He whispered words of comfort into her ear.
"Take it slow. The dizziness will pass. We need to warm you up and get you out of these clothes. You're a popsicle."
"I'm fine," she said, but she leaned into him, loving the warmth of his body. He was dry as a bone, while she was 2 shakes short of dripping wet.
"Find my ass,"
he murmured.
"Damn, I should have shared body heat."
The thought of him curling up to her sent a tingly sensation surging through her veins. Her entire body shook with the chills.
"Okay, we're getting you out of those wet clothes."
He turned to a duffel bag resting against the rear tire and rummaged around inside. When he stood, he held a pair of black sweatpants in one hand and a shirt and sweatshirt in the other.
"No time for modesty."
He came toward her, looking like he would strip off her top. "No way!" She clutched her arms across her body.
"Trust me."
He set his lips into a determined line. "I don't even know you." His eyes crinkled.
"Don't worry, I'm a trained paramedic. You have nothing I haven't seen 1,000 times before. Now, strip."
"No way." But the grim set of his jaw told her he wouldn't be taking no for an answer. Fine. But she wouldn't let him undress her, except her left arm was stiff and didn't seem to want to work. She twisted around, turning her back to him. That seemed to be the only modesty she'd be allowed. CJ lifted her shirt, his warm fingers pressed against her cool skin. He raised the wet fabric over her head, even guiding her arms through the sleeves until she was left standing naked above the waist except for the pink lace of her running bra. She was standing in front of the side mirror. It gave him a perfect view of her breasts. He caught her gaze in the reflection and tipped his head.
"I'm a professional, but I'm not dead."
He lowered the shirt he'd pulled out of the duffel bag over her head. The sleeves hung well past her fingers, and the hem brushed her knees. Shapeless, the shirt was warm and dry, much better than her wet running gear. Thankfully, the shirt was black, because the water from her bra seeped into the fabric. CJ bent to his knees, his intent clear. She stepped away. "Oh, no, I can do this on my own. You go stand behind that pillar."
"No can do. You're swaying on your feet. I don't want you falling over. Besides, my shirt hangs down to your knees. I won't see anything you don't want me to see."
"Like my breasts?"
"Your breasts were covered in that lacy pink bra. Technically, I haven't seen them yet."
Yet? Did that mean he wanted to see them? And did she want him to? She was dizzy, but this time it was for a different reason. That reason stared up at her with sky-blue eyes from where he knelt on the ground. "All right." She nodded, conceding he might be right. His hand touched her outer thighs, and his fingers walked up beneath the shirt to the waistband of her tight running pants. He curled his fingers over the edge of the fabric and pulled the clingy spandex down over her hips. His shirt, as promised, kept her covered. With CJ's help, she stepped out of her running pants. He covered her in reverse, helping her step into each leg of the black sweatpants and lifting the pants over her hips.
"Nice shoes,"
he commented.
"Do you like running in them?"
"I only bought them a few months ago, but they're comfortable."
"Not many people like running in those."
CJ stood, still gripping the top of the sweatpants in his hand.
"Here, hold on to the waistband. My sweat's big on you."
She glanced at him. "Well, you have about 100 pounds on me. How will they stay up?" He lifted a belt.
"With this. But I have to find my knife and poke a hole in it. Your waist is tiny. I bet I could wrap this around you twice."
Not true, but kind of him to say. The belt bothered her, though. She stiffened. During her marriage, she developed an aversion to a man holding a belt in his hands. One day, she wouldn't be plagued by memories of her soon-to-be dead husband. Ex-husband. and after today, Scott could no longer touch her. It would finally be over, and she could move forward with her life. "I don't want to ruin your belt."
Well, let's see. If you wouldn't mind lifting the shirt.
"You just want another peek at my bra," she teased him, then froze at the uncharacteristically forward comment.
I wouldn't mind it.
His comment heated her cheeks. He wrapped the belt around her waist while she held the fabric of the shirt. He poked a hole to make the belt fit, and despite what he said, it didn't wrap twice around her waist. His calloused palm touched her bruised side.
This looks nasty. I'm worried there may be internal bleeding with the amount of bruising you have.
He looked closer.
Seems to have spread.
"It's sore, but I'm okay."
No, you're not.
Already her body was warming up, and his clothes smelled incredible. She resisted the urge to pull the fabric close and sniff.
Okay, let's call for that ambulance. I'll help you walk.
When they got to the street, the amount of damage outside surprised her. The tornado had carved a path of destruction down Main Street, leaving wrecked cars and debris in its wake. Shattered glass and storefronts littered the street. They didn't see any people, but that wasn't a surprise. It was almost noon and a Sunday. Most people would have been at home or worshiping at church. "Tell me more about the tornado," she said with awe.
Touched down moments after you launched yourself into the street.
"I didn't launch myself into the street. I was tossed."
Launched or tossed. Next time you want to get a man's attention, there are far safer ways.
She bit her lower lip, trying not to laugh. "I wasn't trying to get your attention. I was struck by lightning,"
Almost.
he corrected.
If you'd been hit, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
On that sad note, he fished out his cell phone. Filtered gray light shone down on the town. A faint gusting wind and a sprinkling of rain were all that remained of the massive storm. A grim expression fixed his face.
A tornado hit the county hospital. They're diverting to St. John's in Clear Creek. All the ambulances are busy.
"That's over 20 miles away. Maybe you could just take me home? It's not far from here." He shook his head.
No, you need to get checked out by a doctor. I'll drive you to Clear Creek. Car's a mess, but it might get us that far. Do you know how to get there?
She did. He went to collect the car, loaded her up, and took off down the street following her directions. They had to swerve around debris. Driving over the smaller stuff had her gritting her teeth against the jarring vibrations. 100 questions flashed through her mind. He seemed attracted to her, and for a moment, she wondered if he would be interested in seeing her again. But she shelved that thought. While she'd been able to hide from most of the media blitz, Melissa Patterson was a tainted woman. Scott's infamy fouled her life, seeped into the cracks and crevices, and nothing could ever remove the stain he had left. If CJ would have realized who she'd been married to, he'd have put her back on that road and let the tornado have her. She wrapped her arms around her waist and gave herself the only hug she would ever get. For the 1,000th time, she cursed Scott for ruining her life. 5. Emergency. Melissa. St. John's Community Hospital buzzed with the disorganized chaos that followed a natural disaster. Melissa's knight in shining armor parked in the emergency parking lot and carried her inside the building. She hadn't protested, although she should have. There was something heartwarming about being carried in a strong man's arms. The last time that had happened, she'd been wearing white, the color of innocence and the beginning of hell. Thinking about Scott ruined the moment with CJ. In a poor attempt to reclaim it, she wrapped an arm around his neck and leaned against his shoulder. The steady rise and fall of his chest, the solid thump, thump, thump of his heart comforted her on a soul-healing level. CJ's overprotectiveness touched her deeply. The attention he lavished on her made her feel special, but she worried about the inconvenience she was causing. No one had been around the past 3 years to lean on, let alone hold her close. She basked in the warmth of this stranger's compassion, wishing for something more, yet knowing the moment was only a transient thing. CJ barreled through the crowd in the lobby and strode up to the front desk, where where a woman managed the line of patients and soothed worried family members. The middle-aged woman's bun was lopsided on her head. Strands of hair worked their way free and stuck out in all directions. Bags drooped under her eyes as they pinched against the task of handling an overwhelming crowd. The long line of patients gave CJ nasty looks.
Victim of a near lightning strike.
He spoke with an authoritative air, like a man used to being in charge.
Concussive blast tossed her in the air.
The nurse gave him a hard look. That's quite a story.
She can't stand because she's dizzy, and she has bruising along her left side, which is getting worse. I'm worried about internal bleeding.
Bleeding? Surely he was being dramatic and trying to justify why he cut to the head of the line. But she did feel lightheaded, and the room seemed to be spinning. The nurse's eyes widened. You're serious? He nodded. That sent the overworked nurse into action. In less than a minute, the staff had Melissa stretched out on a gurney and whisked into a treatment room. CJ never left her side, except when they took her to get a CAT scan. He waited outside while technicians imaged her with practiced efficiency. They wheeled her back to the emergency room and said a doctor would be by soon. Soon? She didn't believe that. Other people needing help inundated the emergency room. A young doctor rushed in moments later, a wrinkled white coat covered even more rumpled scrubs. Deep furrows lined his face, and the bags under his eyes revealed more than stress. He glanced at the chart.
Miss Doe, is that your real name? We didn't have time for paperwork.
CJ answered.
The
doctor looked at Melissa. She wasn't sure what her name was now. With the divorce papers signed, she guessed her maiden name would suffice. Melissa Evans. The doctor turned to CJ.
Well, Mr. Evans, your wife sustained a serious injury to her spleen. There are several cracked ribs and one that's broken on the left side. She needs surgery and might lose the spleen. Best case, the surgeons control the bleeding and leave the spleen intact. If all goes well, we'll keep her for a couple of days and do serial scans to make sure the bleeding is controlled.
He barely looked up from his chart.
And if she loses her spleen, it will take longer.
Melissa stared at the doctor while he rattled off the extent of her injuries. She tried to process the information but failed. All she understood was something was wrong with her spleen. Even with the beatings Scott had given her, she'd never needed surgery, and that bruising had been far worse than this. CJ gripped her hand. Her attention turned to the heat of his touch.
What about her head? I'm worried about a concussion. She's dizzy and has trouble with her balance.
She dropped her head onto the pillow and allowed her eyes to close. Exhaustion pulled at her, and she wanted nothing more than to sleep. The doctor continued, speaking more to CJ than to her. Her mind focused on what CJ was doing with his thumb, drawing lazy circles over her inner wrist. Now that she was being taken care of, would he leave? Would she ever see him again? Asking for his phone number seemed too forward. Hell, the ink on her divorce papers was barely dry.
There's evidence of a mild concussion.
The doctor's voice droned in Melissa's head.
Considering she avoided the lightning, we should be thankful things aren't much worse. Gabby said you were near a twister?
Melissa cracked open an eye. She didn't know a Gabby.
Yeah.
CJ let out a breath.
Outraced one and took shelter in a parking garage. I never saw a tornado before and never want to go through that again. It was practically on top of us. 5 twisters touched down around town. That's the most we've seen in over a decade. One took out County General.
The local hospital. Melissa sent a prayer for those caught in the path of that tornado. The doctor continued.
Another wiped out a trailer park. Oh, that's horrible,
CJ said. CJ's concern for others warmed her heart. He kept stroking her arm, providing much-needed comfort. When she winced against the pain, he gripped her hand.
Well, don't worry too much about your wife. We'll take good care of her.
Her gut twisted at the mention of wife, but Melissa caught CJ's wink and relaxed.
She'll go to the surgical floor after surgery. You can wait for her there. Could you give us a moment?
CJ's touch raised goosebumps on her skin.
Sure.
The poor doctor looked worse than she felt. CJ smoothed her hair.
See why I wanted to bring you to the hospital?
Thank you. Surgery? Loss of her spleen? Concussion? Those frightened her, But she remained calm with CJ standing over her. She looked into his baby blues and caught him smiling. Again. His presence made her feel less alone. "I never said thank you for saving me." She managed a pathetic thank you. "You're very courageous." He smirked.
What else was I gonna do? Leave you in the street like a fried and drowned rat?
She laughed and then splinted against the pane. "Poor rat. Glad you decided to help." He brushed the hair off her forehead.
Like there was ever a question.
He gave another of his infuriating winks. She switched subjects, afraid to take the tenderness of the moment further. "You told him I was your wife." He rubbed the back of his neck.
Hospitals are particular about sharing medical information with non-family members. I didn't want to get kicked out until I knew they were taking care of you. They assumed.
"And you didn't correct them." She should have been upset, but found herself more amused than irritated. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. His lips were soft and gentle, and oh, so wonderful. What would those lips feel like against her mouth? For a moment she thought she might find out, but he shifted to place a second kiss on her cheek.
It's been a real pleasure, Mrs. Evans.
She put her left hand on his forearm. "Thank you. I owe you my life." The words, "Will I see you again?" waited on her lips, but she held them back. He stared at her hand, then turned toward the door. She'd hoped he might stay, but he spoke the words which ended everything.
I have to go. I'm supposed to be somewhere else.
"Thank you." She struggled with her feelings, straining to keep them from showing, but did he have to leave? This time, he brushed his lips over hers.
Take care of yourself, Melissa.
Her last moments with CJ passed in the blink of an eye. First, he was lightly brushing her lips with a kiss that wasn't a kiss, and then he was gone. She ran a finger over the spot where his thumb had drawn circles on her inner wrist. His touch lingered there, and she swore she could feel the heat of his skin. Her wedding ring flashed in the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. The 3-carat diamond sparkled with a brittle light. He had called her Mrs. Evans. Oh, no! She tugged at the ring, but the damn thing wouldn't slide over the swelling of her knuckle. Why had she never taken it off? She was still struggling when a technician came to take her to surgery. Maybe that's why CJ had left. If she'd learned anything about him in their brief time together, he was a gentleman. Now, she had no way of finding him to explain she no longer belonged to any man, let alone a serial killer. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Rescuing Melissa, the Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1. Written by Ellie Masters. Narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes. This program was produced for JEM Publishing, LLC. Text copyright 2018 by Ellie Masters. Performance and production copyright 2021 by Ellie Masters.
Hello, this is Ellie Masters. I hope you enjoyed the first 5 chapters of my romantic suspense novel, Rescuing Melissa. I like to think of this book as romantic suspense meets The Silence of the Lambs. At the end, you can tell me if you agree or not. I think you'll find Pierce to be a spine-chilling villain who meets his match when he decides to claim Melissa Patterson as his queen. Add in CJ, our alpha hero and guardian, and you've got a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance all rolled into one. Make sure you don't miss out on the rest of Rescuing Melissa. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to tap the bell to be notified when new chapters are posted for your audio reading enjoyment. Let me know what you think in the comments. I can't wait to read your thoughts. And while waiting for more, you can check me out at elliemasters.com, and you can check out all my books at elliemasters.com/books. Or you can find my books on Amazon at elliemasters.com/Amazon. If you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, you can read all my books for free. Until next time, this is Ellie Masters bringing you the best of romantic suspense.